The one and only Louis XIV and his simple little house in the country, the small village at the time called Versailles in France. So yes, I am being completely sarcastic when I say small little palace. You would be hard pressed to find another space that is larger and more impressive, that communicates the power of a ruler, as well as Versailles does for Louis XIV in France during the French Baroque period. So I just wanted to show you a couple pictures before we move into it. Here you can see just kind of a slightly bird's eye view looking down at the original portion of the palace on the left, with the great, beautiful black and white checkered, or kind of more geometric abstract patterns of that courtyard, and then the one of the great power portraits of Louis on the right. And then, of course, the famous Hall of Mirrors, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit. So here we'll start off with context. There are so many pictures that College Board wants you to know with the Versailles Palace that I'll try to be clear about where is formal quality or where is content and context. But I think a lot of this will be context, and then a few things will be content. But there are 5 pictures associated with Versailles. So first of all, Versailles itself was the palace of Louis XIV, who was known as the Sun King. Now, he would often relate himself to the Greek god Apollo, who is the god of the sun. And so you'll see um, around Versailles, especially in the gardens, there are many sculptures of Louis depicted as the sun god Apollo. And it's an imagery and an association with the sun that is continued throughout in various ways of the palace. One of the quotes I think would be really good for you to use in an essay with Versailles and Louis XIV, kind of setting up the grand nature and the ultimate absolute power of Louis, would be either the French "L'état c'est moi," or if you can't remember the French or how to spell it, a simple "I am the state" would work well too. So, the French government is Louis. Louis is France. France is Louis at this time. There was no kind of separation of the two. He was that grand, that big, that charismatic, and that powerful. And really, all of that power is kind of consolidated here in the palace. So I think he built it, one, because he had such great associations with it from when he was a child. He used to go to this kind of countryside setting where his father had built a hunting lodge. So he spent a lot of time there in his youth. But also, he realized that you could get glory not just from wars, but in the buildings and what you create as well. And also, it was a way for him to get out of Paris, to move about 10 miles away from Paris, which today would take no time, to get from Paris to Versailles. But back in this time period with your horses and your buggies, it would take much longer. It would feel far more remote. So he's trying to get away from the scheming, aristocracy, the rich, the nobility, and to have control and to keep people, certain people who, it's like that whole phrase of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. He could keep certain people separated, some left in Paris, some kept here in Versailles, and then he could control their actions, keep them separated and unable to kind of gather together and scheme against him or form their own kind of rebellious groups. So ultimately, Versailles becomes the center of government, therefore really the center of France. And during this time period, honestly, in the 17th century, mid to later 17th century, so like 1670s and on, really France and Versailles and Louis, they are the centers of power in the world. So this is one of the images that you need to be aware of. It's basically showing you a grand aerial view of the entire complex and some of the town of Versailles as well. Now, first and foremost, Louis decided to make sure that Versailles was built on an east-west axis line. So when the sun rose, that it would rise in alignment with the palace. And in fact, the sun's, would go right in the heart center of his own bedroom, because the bedroom was the center complex of the entire Versailles palace. So when the sun rose, it would rise, in alignment with the palace. When it set, it would set in alignment with the palace. And that's just reinforcing the idea that he is the Sun King, that he is associated with the sun, that he has almost this power to control and harness that energy of the sun. We'll talk about how, and you can put this in content too, that the symbolism of, or the architecture of the main palace that Louis built is in the classical style, like a lot of Greek and Roman temple qualities here. And that he's trying to basically associate himself with the intellectual achievements, the cultural achievements of that classical period of Greece and Rome. And then a lot of the sculptural detail on the inside, the ornate decoration on the inside, the luxury materials that are more on the inside, although some are on the outside too, that's more in the Baroque style, and that was a symbol of his wealth and power. So all of the style involved in Versailles, inside and outside, the classical, the Baroque, all then are working toward communicating a certain message that Louis wanted to communicate. I am the heart of all intellect, all culture. I am, all powerful, the absolute monarch of France and really of the world. And so ultimately at its height, I think it's like 20 football fields in size, about 20,000 people lived here. Of course, Louis and his family, friends, talked about enemies, courtiers who would be working for and attending to the king and the royal family's every wish, servants, soldiers. It was really a functioning city in and of itself outside of Paris. So, some of that is content, and most of that information is content just about the basic visual of and how it is structured and the ultimate style that he uses and why he uses it. Now, this is the second image from College Board, and what it's doing is showing a close-up of that classical style. And, you can see here, we're not reaching for great height. Instead, we're reaching for width. So I would put down, maybe in content, just put palace, and then write down a couple of things. And again, I'm just repeating that you have classical elements, and again, the repetition of those elements. So for example, like the repetition of the arch, the repetition of columns and pilasters, those kind of create this reminder of the great classical past and the power. And it also is going to create the illusion of greater width and a greater size to the building. And in and around the building, all the buildings of Versailles, you also had sculptures of Roman gods and emperors. And again, that's just reinforcing Louis's connection and wanting to connect with the classical past and the power of Rome. So, this structure, this part here that College Board wants you to see, they're just really emphasizing that classical connection. And so if they showed me this on the test, that's where I would spend my time. It's really simple, but grand. That makes sense. So simple classical design on a big, scale. And again, it's all for the display of power and associating him with the past. Now, this is a little bit more specific. So this is the third image that College Board wants you to know, and it's the courtyard. Now this, if you see Versailles and it's the red brick building, that's the original structure that was built by his father. So you could put that in context. So like the original building was a hunting lodge. But then in content, you could put the courtyard and hunting lodge, just put red brick. It overlooks this beautiful black and white marble courtyard. It shows you some of the ornate Baroque sculptural elements here, in addition to, some of that traditional classical, like rounded arches and columns, but especially at the top level where you see all of that gold. That's just conveying, of course, power, associating Louis with the sun. So it's just another expression of his power. But really the most important thing here is that this is part of the original structure that was here with Louis's father, Louis XIII. Now the Hall of Mirrors is probably the most famous part of the entire structure of Versailles. It extends along the entire length of the central building. And one side, you're going to have windows that look out over the garden, and that's where the sun's going to come in. And the sun, of course, is going to be an important association with Louis. On the other side of the hall, you have these beautiful mirrors. Ultimately, there are about 357 mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors, so it's aptly named. But it's all about reflecting light. So everything in this hallway, and trust me, the only thing that this hallway is used for is Louis would get up, he'd get out of his bedroom after people got him ready, and he'd walk down this hallway to go to his chapel. And so people would gather here and consider it a great honor to gather here and see Louis walk from point A to point B. There wasn't much else it was used for at the time. But over time, of course, it's been used for many things. Most famously, this is the place where the treaty was signed between the Allies and Germany with World War I, with the Treaty of Versailles. But going back to the materials, gold, crystal in the chandeliers, and there are 43 of them. These gold sculptures, the shiny marble floor, the mirrors. Everything in this hallway is reflective, using reflective materials, again, to convey his association with Apollo, his status as the Sun King, his power and his wealth. And then on this barrel vaulted ceiling, there are about 30 paintings, these ceiling frescoes, that were showing images from Louis's reign, like early on in his time as king. So that is the Hall of Mirrors. Now my favorite part, and sorry this image is a little blurry, but this is the College Board image, the gardens of Versailles, the orangerie, the gardens. And this is where Louis can show his power and his power over nature. Very similar to like Trajan and Apollodorus with their power over nature when making the forum. This is where Louis has orange, lemon, pomegranate, palm trees brought in at great expense from places where they're native. Portugal, Spain, Italy, all that shows power because those don't grow naturally in France. So also think of Hatshepsut when she was bringing all her luxury trees and plants from Punt in Egypt. She's showing that too. So it's a common thing that these rulers would do. And he has his landscape architect, and I put the name on the slide, André Lenôtre. He manicures, he cuts all the plants and shrubbery in particular patterns. He plants thousands of trees. He builds fountains. He engineers the water system to bring in water from the Seine River in Paris to have the fountains running. This is a perfect example of how art, landscape art and architecture, shows the power of a human being and humans in general, but here it's Louis. The power of a king here to manipulate and to dominate nature. They're almost, I can't think of something more of a powerful symbol than that. And so, these trees that you could not find in France were maintained throughout the year. They'd come inside during the winter months. They'd come outside during the summer months. It was just a continually maintained, changing, sculpted, beautifully large scale symbol of Louis' power. And so this is another image again from College Board. And then I just wanted to give you some images that would show you the gardens on a grander scale, some of the fountains and ponds that you would see in and around Versailles. Some views from the Great Canal, which is probably the biggest water feature in Versailles, looking up then at the palace. People would boat, and people boat today on this Grand Canal. And then I'm thinking I have another image, but possibly not. But, one cannot overstate Versailles and its expression of power of its ruler. I would say for function, absolutely power. Power of this absolute monarch here with Louis. I mean, just look at him here. And palace, space, government, but function here is power. And then for formal qualities, you could do repetition, repetition of the classical architectural elements to suggest his association with that time period and therefore, communicate power about Louis, since you're connecting him to that great powerful era in European history. I think that would be one thing you could do. You could do form or line, honestly, where everything's aligned with the sun on this east-west axis line, to create that sense of power and associate Louis also with the power of the sun as the great Sun King. So again, Versailles, look at the ID information and document for all the different artists involved. But again, this is the French Baroque era, not really considering and talking about religion here. Instead, we are talking about the absolute power of the very charismatic and well-known Louis XIV.